Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to ask Bill Carl, who's president of Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, to bring a brief greeting. And Bill, you're right.
Well, it's a welcome to Pittsburgh. We've been doing that all week. And I told Fred I had one brief little welcome to Pittsburgh story I wanted to share about how historical Presbyterians are in this part of the country and how deep and dense we are in many ways, in many senses of the term. When Jane and I moved here in 1973, where I began my PhD at the University of Pittsburgh and also working with David Buttrick, we had just moved in, and we were driving around in the neighborhood in Penn Avenue, going suddenly the wrong way on the one-way street. Policeman pulled me over, looks at our plates, and says, "Oh, you're from out of town?" I said, "Yeah, well, you're going to have to follow me to the police station and pay for the ticket. It'll be $50. And I said, this is 1973. I said, I don't even have $50. We haven't opened a bank account. He said, "Oh, you don't have any money? Well, then you're going to have to spend the night in jail." I said, "Spend the night in jail?" You know, I'm a pretty calm person, but I was starting to lose it. I can't believe this. I'm a Presbyterian minister. I just came here to work on a PhD. I'm going to start at Pitt tomorrow. He said, "Wait a minute, did you say you're a Presbyterian minister?" I said, "Yeah." Tore up the ticket right there. He said, "You should have said that earlier." And that night, I knew I was in a Presbyterian town. So welcome to Pittsburgh.
Our speaker this afternoon is a person that I think you're really going to enjoy. Heather Sharkey is an associate professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She has been in that position since 2002, if I'm remembering that correctly. She is the author of a number of books dealing with Christians and Muslim relations, the most recent being American Evangelicals in Egypt, Missionary Encounters in the Age of Empire, which was published in 2008 by Princeton University Press. She has a number of articles credited to her talent. She's going to share several things about the Presbyterian experience in the Middle East today. So Heather, without further ado, I'm going to introduce you and let you take care. Thank you.
I hope you're enjoying your lunches. Please continue. I have to say it's a great honor to be here speaking to you today about the history of the American Presbyterian mission in Egypt and its implications for Muslim-Christian relations in the Nile Valley. I'm especially glad to be speaking on behalf of the Presbyterian Historical Society because it's an institution that's been central to my own growth as a scholar, and it holds a very special place in my heart. So thank you very much for having me today. I have just 30 minutes to speak, and I want to leave time for a conversation afterwards, so I will try to be pithy. My talk will have two parts. First, I'd like to discuss some of the major contours of the American Presbyterian mission in Egypt, setting it within the larger framework of 19th and 20th century Protestant missions. And second, I'd like to consider how the American mission in Egypt related to the country's Muslim majority and Christian minority with long-term implications for all parties concerned. Okay, before I get started, let me do a sound check. Can everybody hear me here? Okay? Should I move this down? Is that better? Okay, great. You can also see me over the microphone. At least I can see over the podium. Okay, so let's start with some basic details of history. Details that emphasize the importance of Pittsburgh to our story. In 1853 in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, which I gather is now part of Pittsburgh, and it must be very close to where we're sitting right now, leaders of the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church resolved to send missionaries to Cairo as soon as possible. And indeed, a year later, a husband and wife team sailed from Philadelphia and reached Egypt, where they initiated what soon became the largest Protestant mission to the country. In 1858, their church back home merged with another to form the United Presbyterian Church of North America. And the UPCNA, or United Presbyterian Church, went on to pursue foreign missions in Egypt, Northwest India, what's now Pakistan, Sudan and Ethiopia, and home or domestic missions to African American freedmen, as they called them in the mid-19th century, as well as Native Americans and new immigrants, such as Italian-speaking Roman Catholic immigrants in Pittsburgh and other cities. 1 century later, in 1958, the United Presbyterian Church merged again, this time with the Presbyterian Church in the U.S.A., to form the immediate precursor to today's PCUSA. So this history may be quite familiar to all of you. But I'd like you to consider the following 3 points as by way of context for the story I'm about to tell you. First, in light of the complicated family tree of American Presbyterianism, and I urge you to go to the Presbyterian Historical website, download the map of the Presbyterian family tree, which is absolutely mind-boggling in its complexity. That map, I stare at it every time and try to get my mind around it. Anyway, in light of that, a thing to remember is that the church that maintained the mission in Egypt was the product of mergers, not splits. And this tradition may have helped it to weather theological and social controversies by giving it an internal culture of live and let live. It may help to explain also the considerable coherence and esprit de corps of the mission on the ground in Egypt, because the Presbyterians in Egypt really had their act together. Second point is that the United Presbyterian Church had its center in Pennsylvania and the Midwestern states, and yet, through its missionaries abroad, some of whom were actually born in Scotland, it was able to maintain or develop close and familial relations with British Protestant organizations especially. Given this ecumenism, you may not be surprised to hear that it was a member of the United Presbyterian Church, to be precise, Charles R. Watson, who was a Princeton graduate, a one-time pastor in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, and founder of what is now the American University in Cairo, who first suggested the idea of holding a World Missionary Conference, the famous Edinburgh Conference of 1910, after interacting with British missionaries in Cairo. In other words, the United Presbyterians played a critical role in the Protestant ecumenical movement. And third, the church that sent the mission to Egypt was very education-minded and placed an emphasis on developing schools. Leaders of the United Presbyterian Church emphasized that knowledge was a prerequisite for church membership, and above all, knowledge rooted in the ability of individuals to read and reflect upon the Bible for themselves. All of these features informed the church's culture and gained expression in the mission to Egypt. In Egypt, the American Presbyterians were social radicals, whether or not they saw themselves in that way. They challenged Egyptian traditions and customs, thought of themselves as being vigorous and modern, and considered Egyptian Christianity, as it was then practiced by a small fraction of the population, as antiquated and indeed mummified. That was actually a word that they used in the mid-19th century. Against this context, Presbyterians opened schools for boys and girls, elites as well as people of humble backgrounds. And indeed, they pioneered female education in the country. They also taught grown peasants how to read. And in this regard, their commitment to what we would now call adult continuing education was a big innovation. They set up schools to teach some pre-professional and technical skills such as business administration and modern dairy production. And they opened hospitals and clinics that addressed themselves especially to endemic diseases in Egypt such as bilharzia and ophthalmia, as well as providing basic care and especially maternal and neonatal care. And they also promoted some radical ideas about Christian collective life. For example, they argued that churches were not just for men and boys. Women and girls belonged in there too. In other words, they insisted that it was not immodest for females to join in public worship. When Egyptian women did come to church, They were separated from men by a wooden partition that ran the length of the pews. And the missionaries disapproved of this as well, although these partitions persisted in many Egyptian churches, especially in small towns and villages, well into the 20th century. Instead, missionaries thought that men and women should sit together as families with their children, and that there was no shame in men and women mixing within the church. The missionaries were also very American in their staunch support for individual choice. They even believed that young men and women should be able to choose their own marriage partners, a position that led them in the opening years of the 20th century to organize chaperoned, courtship-style social events in Cairo. Andrew Watson, who was one of the first members of the American Presbyterian mission to Egypt, and actually he was himself born in Scotland, and he was also, by the way, the father of the Charles Watson, whom I mentioned a minute ago. He showed just how far he and his colleagues were ready to go in respecting individual choice. In the chronicle that he published about the mission in 1897, tracing its first 50 years in Egypt, Andrew Watson recalled how in 1862, he and his colleagues had persuaded European and American consuls to intercede with the Egyptian government in order to protect an Egyptian man. This man, who was Muslim by birth, had apparently become an atheist by choice after studying abroad in France. An uproar erupted among some believing Muslims after this man published newspaper articles criticizing the Prophet Muhammad. And indeed, Watson wrote that the Mosque Party, as he called it, agitated to get the Egyptian government to send this man up the White Nile into Sudan for exile and probable drowning as punishment for his apostasy. But thanks to the missionaries' intercession, this man escaped that fate and by 1897 was still living in Cairo. I am very sorry to add, however, and here I'm quoting from Watson, that the man still does not seem to have any religion, though he is a man of good moral character and occasionally pays a visit to our Cairo bookshop, end quote. Now, I find this anecdote remarkable, and it was many years ago that I first read Andrew Watson's chronicle, but this has stuck in my mind. Watson's support for an atheist in an Islamic context where denial of God was a crime punishable by death illustrates powerfully the American Presbyterians' realization that their own freedom to evangelize in Egypt would depend upon others having the freedom to break from tradition in other ways as well. I wonder if Watson was ahead of his time when he accepted that the full freedom to choose religion must accompany a freedom to reject religion as well. I mentioned earlier that the American Presbyterians in Egypt cooperated closely with British Protestant organizations, and this is a point worth repeating. Contrary to the impression that we might gain by reading books that Presbyterians have written for Presbyterian audiences, the American mission in Egypt was not just doing its own stuff. Rather, it was working steadily and collaboratively with a wide array of American and international Protestant missions, organizations, and workers. And I'm talking about the period before World War II here. For example, it was a close ally of the Anglican Church Missionary Society of the United Kingdom, known as the CMS for short, the American Bible Society, the British and Foreign Bible Society, the Young Men and Young Women's Christian Associations, the YMCA, YWCA, the World Sunday School Association, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And by way of a show and tell, I brought you a copy of the 1913 annual report of the American Bible Society, which I was able to buy off of eBay. Who knew it could be a research tool? And I've marked a couple of the pages where the organization mentions its work with Presbyterians in Egypt and the Middle East, and I'll pass this around if you'd like to take a look at that. And I'd also like to point out, by the way, that the photograph on this program here, which was taken around 1922, I recognize the collection because I've used it in the Presbyterian Historical Society. That's a missionary distributing tracts to Muslims in Upper Egypt, Northern Sudan, and that would reflect tracts that other societies would have prepared, other Christian literature societies, such as the American Christian Literature Society for Muslims. Okay, now I myself have a particular soft spot for and interest in the British and Foreign Bible Society because I've had the privilege of using this organization's archives, which are at Cambridge University in England and Cambridge University Library. Beginning in the 1880s and continuing up until World War I, if not beyond, the British and Foreign Bible Society gave the American Presbyterians an annual grant to pay for the salaries of Egyptian women whom the Americans trained as Bible women. These Bible women were grassroots evangelists who sold Arabic Bibles and told Bible stories in villages and city neighborhoods all over Egypt. And they've received very little historical attention, by the way, because the sources about them are lacking. Now, if we look at records of the United Presbyterian Foreign Missions, including in places like the Women's Missionary magazine, we find that many of the funds for the mission in Egypt came from the accumulated donations of congregations in places like Kansas, Iowa, and Illinois. But the money that the British and Foreign Bible Society gave the American Presbyterians to train Bible women was actually coming from the humble donations of Anglican, Baptist, Methodist, Quaker, and other British congregations in places like Wales, Cornwall, Hertfordshire, Yorkshire, and Glasgow. And I have as another show and tell item the 1965 edition of the Gospel in Many Tongues. This is put out by the British and Foreign Bible Society, listing their scripture translations. And I've marked a few of the places where the BFBS actually published Bible translations which American Presbyterians used in southern Sudan. So I'll pass this around if you're interested as well. I find this a fascinating text. Okay, the bottom line is this. The American Presbyterian mission in Egypt was shaped by and was always responding to conditions in the United States, Great Britain, Egypt, and the global context of Christian missions. Moreover, its missionaries were working on the premise that religious belief and practice either was or should be a matter of individual choice. So now let me turn to the second part of my talk by situating the American mission within Egypt's Islamic cultural milieu. The basic goal of the mission in Egypt, as men like Andrew Watson, the missionary chronicler, put it, was universal evangelization, introducing and offering the gospel to everyone. And everyone in Egypt meant a population that was approximately 92% Muslim, 7% Christian, and 1% Jewish by 1850. But, and this is a big but, Egypt was an Islamic state and had been since the 7th century. Its Muslim rulers aimed to follow historical and cultural precedents deriving from the Quran, which Muslims regard as a message that God sent to humankind through the Prophet Muhammad. And they also tried to adhere to Islamic law together with accumulated Muslim traditions. Among these Islamic traditions regarding statecraft and state policy were policies towards Christians and Jews who were believers in God but not Muslims, who held a special status as dhimmis. And dhimmi is a technical term in Arabic. It's usually spelled D-H-I-M-M-I in the singular form. And the term dhimmi suggested that Christians and Jews were protected people in Islamic states who were nevertheless subordinate to Muslims. According to Islamic tradition, local Christians as dhimmis had the right to practice Christianity, but they did not have the right to proselytize. Christian dhimmis also had to adhere to certain behaviors which reflected their inferior status. For example, they could not ride horses, bear arms, ring church bells, or wear the color green, which had been the Prophet Muhammad's favorite color. There were dress codes, conventions about how people should dress to signal their religious identity from the outside, and these persisted into the 19th century.
In an Islamic court of law, the testimony of a Christian or Jew was worth half the testimony of a Muslim. In the event that a Muslim murdered someone, an Islamic court assessed the penalty, the value of the lost life, at a lower scale if the victim was a Christian or Jew. A Muslim man could marry a Christian woman and have Muslim children by her, but a Christian man could not marry a Muslim woman. And while a Christian or Jew was welcome to convert into Islam, a Muslim person could not exit Islam for Christianity or Judaism on penalty of death for apostasy. The American missionaries who reached Egypt in the mid-19th century quickly gained a sense of these traditions and found them daunting. Nevertheless, men like Andrew Watson thought that they were arriving at a particularly auspicious moment when the Islamic world was poised to change and was entering an era of greater religious liberty. They thought this because in 1856, the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul, whose realm theoretically extended to Egypt, had issued an edict declaring Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the empire to be equals and to have the rights of religious freedom accordingly. And the missionaries hoped that this edict would mean that they would be able to introduce Christianity to Muslims. They saw it as perhaps signaling the beginning of a new era. However, the Ottoman Edict of 1856 did not enjoy popular support among Muslims, most of whom continued to believe in the relevance and propriety of Islamic traditions towards Christians. Moreover, there was a widespread and largely accurate sense among Muslims that the Ottoman Sultan had only issued this edict in an effort to curry favor from British, French, and other European diplomats in the context of the Crimean War, which was occurring at the time in which the Ottoman Empire was fighting against Russia. And so the missionaries found themselves in the following awkward situation. Officially, Muslim governing authorities in Egypt, who, like the Ottoman Sultan, were eager to curry European favor, were no longer prosecuting or executing apostates. But unofficially, Muslim families stood ready to apply harsh sanctions and deterrents against any one of their members who seemed to show too much interest in the missionaries' Christianity. The rare Muslims who dared to confess to Christian belief reported facing assaults, imprisonment, and threats of death from their relatives, even as the police collaborated or turned a blind eye. The practical consequence of this situation was that the American Presbyterians in Egypt focused for the most part on converting people who were Christian already. Above all, they focused on Copts, C-O-P-T-S, Copts. That is, members of the Coptic Orthodox Church of Egypt, which traced its formation to the mission of St. Mark during the reign of the Roman Emperor Nero. Indeed, the vast majority of Egyptians who eventually joined the Presbyterian Church, or the Evangelical Church as it became known in Egypt, were from Coptic Christian, not Muslim backgrounds. Now, bear in mind, however, that leaders of the Coptic Orthodox Church were livid about Presbyterian overtures to Coptic Christians, although they were not surprised by these overtures because they had already had similar experiences with Roman Catholic missionaries who had begun to appeal to and convert the Copts of Egypt in the 17th and 18th centuries. As the years progressed, Coptic Orthodox leaders addressed these missionary challenges by reforming their church while borrowing certain ideas and practices from Catholics and Protestants alike. Most famously from the Protestants, incidentally, they borrowed the idea of Sunday schools for children. One long-term consequence of this history is that in the late 20th century, members of the small Egyptian Catholic and Protestant communities began to find that they had a lot in common with each other, and above all, a sense of rivalry with and beleaguerment towards a Coptic Orthodox Church that regarded them as the heirs of foreign missionary interlopers. So I have three more important points to touch on, and then I'll wrap up. In 1882, Britain invaded and then occupied Egypt, starting a period known as the capital O occupation of Egypt period. Many Protestant missionaries and mission executives expected that Western imperialism and the expansion of what the Protestant missionary leader John Mott called the Protestant powers around the world would enable the free preaching of the gospel as never before, and thereby, to use Mott's phrase from his 1900 book, allow the evangelization of the world in this generation. The American Presbyterians thought so too, and stepped up their efforts to evangelize Muslims in Egypt after 1882, thinking that Britain would be ready to protect them. Against this context, in the period between 1882 and the late 1920s, American Presbyterians in Egypt attracted a sprinkling of converts from Islam. But again, the informal social sanctions against Muslim apostates persisted and acted as powerful deterrents. Eventually, however, this situation went on, American missionaries making more overtures to Muslims, but eventually the close and implicit association between missionaries and the forces of British imperialism eventually backfired. As the 20th century opened, Muslim intellectuals began to articulate ideas about Egyptian nationalism, some of which had clear anti-missionary dimensions. In the interwar period especially, nationalists began to pressure Egyptian authorities to crack down on foreign missionaries and their schools, where Muslim critics feared that missionaries could influence and indoctrinate children. Looking back, the year 1928 was a watershed for Egyptian Muslim nationalist and anti-missionary activism. This year, again 1928, saw the formation of the Muslim Brotherhood, an organization that called for the establishment of a more rigorous Islamic government and social order in Egypt. And there were two things about this organization that were novel. First, the Muslim Brotherhood was a populist movement, emphasizing the power of the ordinary Muslim people and not the educated Muslim elites to determine what an Islamic order should be. And second, the Muslim Brotherhood leaders imitated American Presbyterian and other missionary techniques, copying, for example, the idea of adult continuing education for scripture learning, even while being strongly opposed to Christian missionaries and helping to organize rallies against them. The founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, incidentally, was a man named Hassan al-Banna, a school teacher, and in the Arabic memoirs that he published later in his life about his own Muslim mission and calling, he specifically mentioned his dismay over the presence of unmarried female Christian missionaries working in the Egyptian Delta towns where he grew up, including one whom he names. He calls her Miss White. And he says, this is an example of the kind of women who were running around the Delta in this period. Thanks to Presbyterian Historical Society records, I was able to identify this person as Miss Florence White of Grove City, Pennsylvania, who had joined the mission in 1919 at age 22. Banna wrote, and I translate, "These female missionaries, quote, started to evangelize with Christianity in the midst of giving medical treatment, teaching embroidery, and giving lodging to boys and girls in schools. The society waged a meritorious combat against their message, and the Society of the Muslim Brothers succeeded in this struggle later on," end quote. Under pressure from Muslims representing a wide array of political backgrounds, and not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but some groups that were more secular leaning, the Egyptian government began to crack down on missionaries, eventually banning them from teaching Christianity to non-Christian children in their schools. And I trace this process in my book, American Evangelicals in Egypt, which I will pass around also. Okay? Now, pressures to rein in missionary institutions intensified after the 1952 Free Officers' coup in Egypt, which brought Gamal Abdel Nasser to power. But by this time, the American Presbyterians were already finding themselves in a tricky position as a result of the emergence of Israel and the Palestinian refugee crisis in 1948. American Presbyterians then, as still today, found themselves in the awkward position of trying to negotiate between U.S. government foreign policy, which expressed largely unwavering support for the State of Israel, and firm missionary support for the Palestinians more generally, which reflected a concern for the Arab peoples among whom they worked. In Egypt, American missionary support for the Arab-Palestinian cause eventually won the Presbyterians a critical degree of goodwill from successive Egyptian governments and mitigated the anti-missionary sentiment that had built up among Muslims in the early 20th century. And one source even speculated that that sentiment saved the American University in Cairo from nationalization in the 1950s and 60s. Meanwhile, by the late 20th century, Egyptian Christians themselves were occupying ambiguous positions in Egyptian society. Egyptian law proclaimed them full citizens, but at the same time, Egypt's 20th century constitutions, which went through various drafts, continued to define the state as an Islamic state, while the governing establishment upheld certain disabilities for Christians, such as restrictions on church building, barriers against Muslim conversion to Christianity, and the ban on Christian men marrying Muslim women, all of which had deep roots in Islamic tradition. Okay, so now I'm going to wrap up and then turn the floor over to your questions. To conclude, the Presbyterians who went to Egypt in the mid-19th century were believers in a certain kind of American Christianity that emphasized reason, individual liberty, and the capacity of ordinary people to dismantle tradition for the sake of building new and better institutions and cultures. In the evangelical churches that they fostered in Egypt, the American Presbyterians also encouraged practices of voting and collective decision-making, as well as the participation of both men and women in church affairs. Egyptian Muslims and Christians alike admired and even copied many of the American Presbyterians' innovations, such as girls' schools and adult literacy programs. But they remained leery about some of their other radical ideas, including the rights of young individuals to forge their own paths in matters of faith and family formation. Earlier in my talk, I mentioned the 1856 edict, which declared religious equality and freedom among Muslims, Christians, and Jews in what was then the Ottoman Empire. This was the edict that men like Andrew Watson hoped would lead to a new era of religious free choice and Christian mobility in Egypt. Now, you may think that the 1856 edict is a dead letter, it happened a long time ago, etc. But I would argue, on the contrary, that the central question it raised still looms large. Namely, what will or can religious equality, religious liberty, and citizenship mean in states whose majority Muslim peoples are striving to honor or draw inspiration from Islamic traditions? Less than a month ago, Egyptian voters elected a Muslim Brotherhood candidate after the party had been banned for many years in Egypt. This was Mohamed Morsi, who was, inducted as Egypt's president. A variety of news sources present Mohamed Morsi personally as a man of integrity who is worried, like many Egyptians, about the continuing intervention of Egypt's military establishment in politics. Nevertheless, if we had access to good voter polling information, we would find probably that Christians, who still constitute perhaps 7% of Egypt's population, voted overwhelmingly for the other candidate, Ahmed Shafiq, who had some questionable associations with the former Mubarak regime, but who was not from an Islamist party. Many Christians will be worrying about what they can expect from an Islamist, Muslim Brotherhood-controlled presidency and parliament. And complicating the issue is the fact that, one, Muslim Brotherhood supporters reflect a wide range of opinion along the Islamist spectrum, and two, the Muslim Brotherhood looks middle of the road compared to the so-called Salafi parties, which won a quarter of the parliamentary seats in the recent elections and which advocate stricter application of Islamic Sharia law. In this context, will Egyptian Christians be citizens, or, to use the centuries-old term that I told you about, will they be dhimmis, protected but subordinate people? Will they be partners or subjects? A lot has changed in Egypt in the past 2 centuries, and this is in fact what makes Egyptian history such an exciting field for historical inquiry. This said, important ideas, social assumptions, and cultural vocabularies have persisted, including certain Muslim attitudes towards the place of Christians in Islamic societies. The missionary Andrew Watson, who reached Egypt in 1861, died almost a century ago. But if we could revive him now, I suspect that he would recognize the big political debates that are brewing in Egypt, and he would understand how much is at stake for its Christians. Thank you very much. And now I invite any questions that you may have. And perhaps one thing I could do would be to take a cluster, a few questions at a time, and then answer them.
Is your book available in the bookstore or in the Historical Society booth?
You know, I don't think it is. I think you have to get it through a mainstream bookstore or Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or from Princeton University Press.
Could you repeat the names?
American Evangelicals in Egypt. Missionary Encounters in an Age of Empire. You know, I'm not sure. I haven't tried that yet. I think it is. I need to get with the times. I love paper. You know, it's interesting. I did a lot of the research at the Presbyterian Historical Society, where the archives are incredible. And then I was in Egypt in the spring and summer of 2005. But what is significant, perhaps, is that I was fortunate to have received small research grants from the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia and from my home university. I would never have been able to get funding for this project from the Fulbright or any major American funding agency. They would never have approved it. And when I went to read newspapers in Dar al-Kutub, which is the Egyptian National Library, I did not tell them what I was working on, because if I had, I don't think they would have let me use their materials. So in a way, I was kind of fortunate to be working under the radar with this project, because this is considered a very sensitive topic, and it's one that many Egyptians would perhaps prefer not to discuss.
Yes, thanks very much for really a splendid and sweeping presentation. Thank you. I wonder if you could comment, how does the death of Pope Shenouda recently, the turmoil in the Coptic Orthodox Church, and the outmigration of Christians in the region relate to how you see the future for Christians in Egypt?
I think that's a tough question. Pope Shenouda, leader of the Coptic Orthodox Church, was a very autocratic figure in his way. I mean, Egyptian Copts would sometimes say that he was more of an autocrat than Mubarak. And they weren't joking when they said that. And one of the things that he did was to very firmly distinguish Coptic Orthodoxy from Protestantism and Catholicism, and to sharpen the lines there. And he was very much a political player in his way. But my understanding is that because of the level of chance inherent in the selection of a new patriarch in the Coptic Orthodox Church, and there's even an element of a lottery involved, there's real uncertainty about who his successor will be. And now it's very difficult to say, because there's a spectrum of opinion and practice within Coptic Orthodoxy. A lot will depend upon who that person is. And of course, the other wild card is how the government under Islamists, under the Muslim Brotherhood presidency, that may be trying to maintain a broader support base by appealing to more conservative elements, how that's going to relate. One analysis that I read actually suggested that the Coptic Orthodox leader welcomed the idea of Christians being a separate sort of dhimmi community in the sense that it enabled a degree for autonomy and sort of a introspection among Christians. But by contrast, the Egyptian Protestants are much more citizenship-minded and are much more supportive of measures that would enable them to participate broadly in Egyptian society, interacting with Muslims. So there are a lot of cultural battles looming ahead. As far as your question about emigration, many Egyptians would like to emigrate if they could. Egyptian Christians and Muslims would be coming to, North America or Western Europe. The fortunate ones who are able to do so will try to leave, and of course that's cited as a continuing reason for the shrinkage of Christian populations throughout the whole region. And there are parallels there, of course, with Iraq, in a far more war-torn situation, and now also with Syria, where the Muslim Brotherhood parties are gaining influence too. It's an extremely tense and uncertain time.
Is there any relationship between the Protestant Christians in Egypt with those in neighboring countries in Sudan or in Ethiopia?
Well, what's very interesting to me as a historian is how in the post-colonial period, let's say post-1950 period, the Protestant organizations managed to develop strong ecumenical connections, not only among Protestants, but also with Catholics and eventually too Orthodox Christian groups. So there is a lot of collaboration and contact among Christians. And in Egypt, there are sectarian issues between Coptic Orthodox Christians and the Protestants and Catholics. But on the larger stage, there is a sense of solidarity to some degree. But how that can gain expression, how effective that's going to be, is uncertain. And as far as Sudan goes, well, that's another, I could have given a whole talk on Sudan. It's a country that I'm keenly interested in. They split up this past year. Now there's what's left of the northern Sudan is the Republic of South Sudan. In South Sudan, Christian peoples and communities are very strong. What I find fascinating, and so there will be some linkages with Middle Eastern Christians, but actually in South Sudan, I suspect there will be stronger linkages with Uganda and Kenya. And interestingly, South Sudan has begun to forge its own foreign policy, and one of the first things it did was to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. And so you can see how Middle Eastern politics are poised to become involved even in northern Sudanese, southern Sudanese relations in the aftermath of this split.
This is more a comment than a question, but I was delighted to hear you referencing the United Presbyterian Church of North America and their Women's Missionary magazine, because I see it as sort of a SALT or a small organization that can focus a lens on the greater picture of what we've done in missionary.
Well, one of the things I didn't get a chance to say about the United Presbyterians that was also really interesting is that they trained, and sent some of the first credentialed American women doctors to the Middle East. So through their medical missions, they helped to shape women in medicine. And you can see the consequences of that for the type of medical work that the mission was able to do in Egypt with its attention to maternal and neonatal care. All the way in the back. Yeah.
We've been privileged to see in the last couple of years some American women with real power interfacing with Muslim leaders. Ann Curry comes to mind. Hillary Clinton comes to mind. And I'm wondering if your eye as a historian can detect any subtle shifts in the mindset of the generations that are observing that as their leaders interface with women on an almost equal basis.
Do you mean how Muslim leaders will be how the sort of the gender dynamics within Muslim leadership?
Or in the persons within those countries who are growing into adulthood, who see these interactions, is this going to engender a shift?
Well, actually what I find really striking is the influence of, say, Egyptian Muslims who've been trained, received advanced educations in Western Europe and North America. I mean, even Mohammed Morsi, and there have been articles about his wife and the role that she will or will not be playing as First Lady of Egypt and the possible implications of that for women in Egyptian society. I mean, even his wife accompanied him to California when he got his PhD, and they have 2 children who are U.S. citizens. So I think an even more important influence on Muslim leaders that we're going to see, the Muslim intelligentsia and organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, even if they may be claiming to be traditional, or they may be hearkening back to tradition, their kids are American citizens, or their mothers, like one of the previous candidates' mother being an American citizen in California. And so they may look traditional, whatever that means, but they've got a level of sophistication and cosmopolitanism through contact abroad. And I think that's going to be more significant. The fact that there's an awareness of this cosmopolitanism through encounters with different people, especially among the most highly educated classes. But whether that's going to translate into women becoming more active in Islamic organizations, I'm not sure. I could only say, though, that in Egypt in general, there has been a very vibrant feminist movement from the 19th century. It has not generally been Islamist in its leanings, but there's a very strong feminist movement and women, a tradition of women becoming highly educated and professionals, and the Americans helped to lay the foundations for that, incidentally, as well, by encouraging girls and women to get advanced education. So I'm not sure, but I would say just that things are more complicated than they appear. Again, because of Mohammed Morsi's wife having herself lived in California, and how that will change her outlook. Oh, one more? Okay. 2. How about we do 2 here and there? I'll be brief.
Mine might be quick. The missionary who was singled out in that book in the early 20th century. Do you have any idea what happened to her? Do you know her story? It's interesting. The story is very interesting. What happened was the United Presbyterian Church fell on hard times financially. 1926, around the time when Hassan al-Banna was growing up in the Delta, was the actual peak of the American Presbyterian presence in that region. That missionary was sent home. There weren't funds to continue paying her. And in the next 20 years, the American Presbyterian mission contracted in the villages where Hassan al-Banna grew up and became more focused in urban areas. And I think one consequence of that was that, contrary to the original aims of the mission, the American Presbyterians found themselves over time catering increasingly to urban elites and not to villagers. And that ends up having a kind of consequences, a kind of a class dimension towards the kind of people who encounter Presbyterians and develop positive relations with them.
I wanted to share an incident. The Synod of Southern California and Hawaii has a sister synod relationship with the Synod of the Nile of the Coptic Evangelical Church. And we do constant exchanges. And on one of our exchanges, one of our members got quite ill in Egypt. And so the Consul General of Egypt to the United States, located in Los Angeles, is a Muslim woman who graduated from American University, but her mother got a degree from Presbyterian missionaries. She's always been very helpful, but she made it very plain that most of the gains that women will make in Egypt will go back to Presbyterian missionaries. And she herself is Muslim.
Yeah.
I mean, it really reinforces what you said.
Yeah.
Heather, thank you.
Thank you.
Before we go on our way, there is one group that I did not recognize that I see them clustered here. Members of the Committee on the Office of the General Assembly, thank you also for being here. Raise your hands, so sure. Thank you. To everyone here, if you're not familiar with PHS, please stop by our booth in the exhibit hall. Visit our website, look into some of our new innovative programs, and see how we serve at Presbyterian Church U.S.A. Thank you for being with us today. Enjoy the rest of your time at General Assembly. Go in peace and serve the Lord.